Okay, so the war's over now, and we got to talk about the legacy, but more importantly, what happens after the war. That's why this video is titled Reconstruction. We'll get to that in a second. So legacy of the war first. You have 600,000 dead, 375,000 injured. I mean, it was just an absolute bloodshed of a war. All right, the southern economy was crippled. Their land was ruined. Their crops destroyed. Their property was just absolutely ransacked by this war. And then on April 14th, 1865, Lincoln was eventually shot by John Wilkes Booth, and he died the next day. So he's been assassinated. So we have a new president come in, Andrew Johnson, and Lincoln had done so much. And his plan for Reconstruction was, obviously, as we talked about with Grant, was to heal the nation. And so with him gone, who knows what the nation's going to look like now. So the U.S. was now in union now, and it wasn't just a bunch of states. So we're back together, and the power has kind of shifted back to the national government. We're no longer all these state entities because we need to focus on being a country. Industry was on the rise now. The Northeast economy was picking up a lot, and farming was on the decline because the South no longer had that strong workforce of slaves they had. They had to find alternative ways to make that. So industry really got on the rise as people learned to make goods and stuff like that. So just before the end of the war, Congress passed the 13th Constitutional Amendment, and it abolished slavery in the United States. It was actually passed on my birthday, January 31st, 1865. I wasn't born in 1865, obviously, but it was passed on my birthday. This is the amendment that abolished slavery. Lincoln wanted to make sure that our Constitution absolutely outright denied anybody the right to own slaves in this country, as it very well should. So now that we've denied slavery, as everybody knew that it should have been abolished by this point, you had the South had to be brought back into the Union. So how are we going to do that? How are we going to bring the South back into the Union? We have 4 million slaves that were once slaves that had to be integrated back into daily life, and they're going to run into racism, they're going to run into violence, prejudices, and now the nation just had to rebuild. And that rebuilding process is known as Reconstruction. So Reconstruction is the period from 1865 to 1877. It's about, obviously a 12-year period, very short period, about a decade, in which the government attempted to rebuild Southern way of life and Southern society. So Lincoln wanted to treat the South with respect. That's why he had Ulysses S. Grant just tell all the Confederate soldiers, go home. Lay down your arms, here's some food, go home. And he was going to pardon government officials, Jefferson Davis, Robert E. Lee, all these guys, and he was going to allow Southern representatives back into Congress. This has been a very quick and easy and forgiving transition, but he was assassinated. And so when he was assassinated, Andrew Johnson became president. All right, so Congress set up the Freedmen's Bureau to help former slaves. It was a government institution to help former slaves figure out a way to get back into life. So after Lincoln was assassinated, as I said earlier, Vice President Andrew Johnson became president, and he believed the president was in charge of Reconstruction, not Congress. So the president should dictate how the Union was going to come back together. So Johnson offered amnesty or pardons, so they excused the behavior of a lot of white Southerners and Confederate leaders as long as they pledged their loyalty to the United States. So if these people like Robert E. Lee and Jefferson Davis, the big guys we've been talking about, as long as they pledged their loyalty to the United States, they could be pardoned and forgiven and welcomed back into the Union, if you will. So President Andrew Johnson's Reconstruction failures, he had a rough go. I mean, when he became president, he had a rough go. His main focus was readmitting the South, readmitting Southern states. And he didn't really do a lot to help former slaves. You can see here, he didn't help them to get civil rights. He didn't help them to figure out ways to integrate. And so, sorry, somebody just walked in here. And so all that stuff was going on. I lost my train of thought. Oh yeah, okay. So the Southern states, since Andrew Johnson wasn't doing much to help African Americans, the Southern states created black codes. All right, and these black codes were laws that limited the rights of African Americans, very similar to slave codes when these were laws to keep slaves enslaved. Now you had black codes popping up throughout the states. All right, Johnson was impeached, so he was accused of doing something wrong. The House impeached him, but the Senate kept him in office by 1 vote, so he was never removed from office. He was impeached for his views on civil rights, or lack thereof, really, and his views on Reconstruction. Nobody really agreed with the way he should have done it. Congress felt like it should have gone, Reconstruction should have been different. The way we heal our nation, the way we rebuild the South should have been different. So congressional Reconstruction. So at this time in Congress, Republicans outnumbered Democrats, obviously, because the Republicans are anti-slavery, so a lot of Democrats haven't been getting voted in. All right? But the Republicans were split over the issue of Reconstruction. Moderate Republicans wanted states to govern themselves. They wanted those states' rights still. But the radical Republicans wanted national government to rebuild the South and protect the civil rights of African Americans. These radical Republicans did a lot for civil rights back then, and they wanted the nation to make sure the civil rights were protected for African Americans and that we were rebuilding the South. So the radical Republicans really had a strong hold in Congress at this time. So the Republicans wanted equality for African Americans to be protected by the Constitution. So they proposed the 14th Amendment. All right, so we've already proposed the 13th Amendment, which abolished slavery. Now we're doing the 14th Amendment, which guaranteed citizenship to African Americans. Therefore, they were granted equal protection of the laws. All right, so they were guaranteed to be protected by the law, a good step in civil rights, and the right to vote came later. So that's the 14th Amendment. The radical Republicans really tried to push this through. President Johnson and every Confederate state, except for Tennessee, refused to ratify the 14th Amendment, refused to support it. They didn't want equal citizenship for African Americans. So the Republicans teamed up, to begin a phase called Radical Reconstruction. So the radical Republicans took control of Radical Reconstruction. So the new Southern states now had to do two things to rejoin the Union. One, they had to approve new state constitutions that gave all adult men the right to vote. All right, so the new constitutions these Southern states would draft had to give all men the right to vote. All right, and this was in response to nobody supporting the 14th Amendment. Second, they had to ratify the 14th Amendment. So now that the radical Republicans have control and they're initiating radical reconstruction, all right, we have got to get this 14th Amendment ratified. That's what the radical Republicans want. So Southern states have to do two things to be readmitted to the Union. All right, so of course, by 1870, all Southern states had approved new constitutions that allowed voting for all men, and they were let back into the Union. So they had done these things here. Okay, so life during Reconstruction. What was it like to live during this time period? Well, many African Americans attended freedmen's schools. These are schools set up by, the Freedmen's Bureau, where they could learn to read and write, and this really helped them to open up opportunities and improve their life for when they were out there, learning to read and write, helped them to read contracts if they were hired out to work on farms, like a lot of them were. Many white Southerners worked hard, but a lot of them used violence to prevent, many white Southerners worked hard to prevent African Americans from going to school, and they used a lot of violence to do so. All right, that reads weird, so make sure you understand that many white Southerners worked hard and used violence to prevent African Americans from going to these schools and learning. But a lot of African Americans were really diligent, and they knew that education was the key to their success, and they valued that because they had not had that for so long. Many African Americans turned to sharecropping. This was, it was a way for them to have a life, but it wasn't a very good one. All right, so landowners provided tools and seeds as long as those farmers, the African American farmers, would give them a share of their crops back. So sharecropping, and it wasn't very fair. A lot of African Americans who turned to sharecropping lived in poverty. Because the farmers would demand more back from them, and the African Americans just made enough to sell and provide for their families, so they didn't really account for anything being a sharecropper, but for many of them it was one of the only ways to survive. So racism and violence increased dramatically in the South during this time. You see the rise of the Ku Klux Klan, which is a terrorist organization that targeted African Americans and Southern whites, or any really white supporters of civil rights. So you had the Ku Klux Klan going around and targeting with violence and using that stuff. So the KKK used violence and attacked African Americans and white Republicans who supported civil rights, as I said earlier. And the Democratic Party power rose because Republicans were now afraid to go vote because they feared the KKK. So the KKK really kind of helped for the Democrats to gain a little bit of power in this because the KKK used fear and terrorism to get the way they wanted, which is clearly not what we're looking to do here in America. So the final days of Reconstruction, let me move this up here so we can see a little bit. The final days of Reconstruction. So in 1868, Ulysses S. Grant, who was the Union general in the Civil War, won the presidency with the help of a large African American vote. You have a lot of African Americans voting now. And the Republicans, the radical Republicans, they were scared the South was going to put some more laws in place to prevent African Americans from being able to vote. So they put out the 15th Amendment, which said voting could not be prevented on account of race, color, or previous condition of servitude. Meaning that anybody now could be allowed to vote as long as you were a male. Women, not quite yet. This amendment was ratified in 1870 and, as I said, did not apply to women, but it did give all men the right to vote. And obviously the South continually set up laws to try to prevent African Americans from voting or make it hard for them to register to vote and all sorts of stuff. And Grant also fought diligently against the Klan, the KKK, and he passed a ton of anti-Klan laws to prevent that violence and protect the civil rights of African Americans and the white Southerners who supported civil rights. All right, Grant had a lot of scandal in his administration. Maybe nothing particular that he did, but there's a lot of people that he chose to work with that were, they were just shady characters, and that scandal in his administration really hurt the support for Reconstruction. So, while Grant did a lot for civil rights, he really ultimately hurt himself by having all this scandal in his administration, and the support for Reconstruction from the public and in the government started to go downhill dramatically. All right, so the end of Reconstruction. Let me just shift the board up here. All right, the end of Reconstruction and what it means to us as Americans and our country. All right, so despite the scandal in Grant's administration, Reconstruction did last a little bit longer until the 1876 presidential election. All right, so that's the one we're running. In 1876, the results were all mixed up together. All right, we had things going everywhere, and so it forced the compromise of 1870, which allowed the Republican candidate Rutherford B. Hayes to become president. So the Republicans said, "Hey, give us Rutherford B. Hayes as president, and we're going to give you some things." So in order to become president, the Republicans had to give up a lot of their Reconstruction plans, and you really saw the Democrats rise into power because of this. So some of the Republican Reconstruction plans they had to give up. Soldiers were removed from the South. The government took soldiers out, and the South could live down there without soldiers anymore. Republicans had to get rid of that in order to have their candidate as president. The government gave the South money to rebuild. So the government's giving them money to rebuild railroads, build their buildings back, supply their economy again. And Hayes, who's now our president, the Republican president, would appoint a Democrat to his cabinet. And the Democrats promised to respect African American rights. All right, so that's kind of what happened. The Republicans gave up a lot and in order to do so, and that kind of freed up the South, and it really started to end Reconstruction. So Reconstruction was over, and Democrats were back in power after the 1876 election. The Democrats had gained power back in government, and they were no longer vastly outnumbered by Republicans. So Reconstruction did unite the country, and that's important. It did reunite the country, but the rights of African Americans were really blurry. All right, there was a lot out there to support them, but there was just as much to go against them. All right, because the national government did not enforce the spirit of the 13th and 14th Amendments, meaning that they did put those out there. They're in our Constitution: equal citizenship, protection of the law, no slavery. But because the southern states were able to put some laws in, they kind of went against, or not kind of, they did go against those amendments, specifically the 14th and the 15th. That the national government didn't enforce that, so there were still a ton of unequal rights, obviously, as we know in the South, for many years to come, and we don't really address that till about almost 100 years later, which is just a shame and a disgrace on our country. So the states still had rights to create those unfair laws, as I was saying, plus racism and violence was huge. I mean, it was just all over. And this really kind of entered us into, as far as civil rights go, really a sore spot in our country. But that is the idea of Reconstruction, and that's important to know that after the Civil War, Reconstruction, the goal of it was to bring our country together, which it did, but it left a lot of open lines of, or just a lot of open questions regarding civil rights in America that we were going to have to address, and rightfully so.